Hi, this is Phil Leach again, and in this video teaching I want to talk about basic communication skills. This will be in two parts, and so here we have part one. I want to begin by talking about just a number of foundational skills in communication, and the first you'll see on the screen there is reality. Now, because of who we are and what we do, this is one of the easier things to address, areas to address. But it is important that we speak out of who we are and what we understand in our own walk with God. We're not pretending, we're not claiming more than we are, because reality is one of those things that communicates, and unreality communicates whether we want it to or not. People are well able to spot a fraud, spot somebody that's insincere, and we're to be people, of course, who are speaking with genuineness. Now, one of the reasons this is here is because the things I'm speaking about are true in preaching, teaching, or basic public speaking. And if I was at a meeting trying to convince people to buy a car, then these kind of questions would be important. But for those of us who are seeking to share the word, then this should be a foregone conclusion. So, honesty, integrity, reality. We speak out of reality. The second thing is shape. In other words, structure. A message needs to have structure. And I've mentioned this already, but people need to be able to follow along with what we're saying. Otherwise, they can lose the plot, as it were. And when they do that, then what can happen is they quit listening. And so a good outline, a good structure is important for many people, not for all, but for most. And then volume. Volume is important. This is so easy to get right, but so often we can get it wrong. People need to be able to hear what we're saying. It is so basic. And so when you stand in front of your audience, the best way to handle this is to begin by looking at the person at the very back of the room and to start speaking to them. This can often help you in the area of volume. Have a friend, if this is likely to be a problem, at the back who can indicate if you're not loud enough. But if people can't hear, then it's a tremendous shame, and what can happen is they can just quit. And so volume is important. We will speak about use of a microphone a bit later, but make sure you're loud enough and people can hear. And then the use of emotions. Now, of course, emotions can be very manipulative, and some people actually learn the art of manipulating people through emotions, and that is something which, of course, we definitely don't want to do. But as you speak, don't be frightened of showing emotions. What you're speaking about may often be very emotional, maybe stirring your heart, especially if you're sharing deep things from your own experience or the reality of other people's situations. And so there is a very definite place for emotions, but of course they can't be so prevalent that it stops us communicating. We need to be able to continue to communicate well, but emotions are part of our humanity and therefore should be part of our communication. One of the challenges we have is maintaining attention, and there's a number of what we call areas of interference. Interference is that which would take people's attention away from listening to what we're saying. And one of them is what I've called internal interference. Now, this is one of the most difficult to deal with, because this is when people come and they are preoccupied with things that are going on in their life, or areas they're wrestling with, and they can be, as I say, predominant and take their attention away. I remember a number of years ago in one of my schools, we had a student who, just before she arrived, had a broken engagement. And this was something that was utterly devastating for her. And I was so aware that during class time, she was away in a different world, just wrestling with the heartbreak and the pain of that particular period of her life and what she was walking through. And the answer, of course, was for us to love and support, encourage and help her through that time. But it is important we are aware that when people come, it may be they come to the meeting with an awful lot going on, and at times this internal interference can take their attention away. So we handle that with prayer, support, doing our best, and trusting God that even despite what they're walking through, they would hear the things they need to hear. There's also a natural wandering. We need to realise that most people take a little mental holiday for a few seconds every now and then. Minds wander. And part of our job is to be drawing people's attention back. And there's different ways to do that. It can be done by the sound of our voice, intonation. It can be done with movement. It can be done with a change of visual aid, PowerPoint or some other visual aid. It can be done in a number of ways. But nonetheless, we need to be aware of the natural wandering that people have. We all have that. And then there can be the physical conditions of the room. If you're in a room and it is very warm, then people can feel very sleepy. Or it could be the sunlight is coming in and shining in their eyes, and it's a distraction for them. There can be different things with regards to room that can be really awkward. Another area to be aware of is the time of day. The time just after lunch is always difficult for people, just part of the metabolism of our body. And so if you're teaching people after lunch, just be aware you've got a bit more of a struggle than if it was in the evening or if it was in the morning especially. And it's worth recognizing that. Sometimes I even say that. If this is the time I'm speaking, I may say something like, this is the sleepy hour. And so let's just be aware of that and give extra effort. And likewise, the day of the week. I remember a number of years ago, I was invited to teach Bible study to one of our Crossroads courses here. And the slot they gave me was Friday afternoon. And one of the things I learned was that is probably the most difficult time of the week when it comes to having people's attention. It seemed to me that people had already checked out for the weekend, and it was really hard work. Now, of course, if it was a weekend event and people arrived Friday morning and Friday afternoon was the first of the weekend's meetings, then that would be different. There'd be a whole different dynamic. But after a week of teaching and school, Friday afternoon is certainly the most difficult time. And so we need to be just aware of maintaining people's attention, and we'll explore more about this in a few moments. When it comes to the material we use, I want to really encourage you to give attention to the evidence for the things you say sources and reliability of material. This really comes down to part of the area we were talking about before, the area of reality, and that is that when we make proclamations, it may be something like a third of the Old Testament is Hebrew poetry. Now, we don't necessarily have to give the source, although doing that can add weight to what we're saying, but we do need to know that what we're saying is true. Either we've read the Old Testament through and we've actually done the study ourselves, or we may want to say something like the scholar Barton Payne says in his studies that a third of the Old Testament is Hebrew poetry. But whether we say that or not, it's important that we take a note of the source for these kind of claims. Whether we keep a note of the website we've got that material from, or whether we have a record of the book and the page number. Let's give attention to the fact that the facts and figures we use, the statements we make, are authentic and are reliable. And let's be really careful about exaggeration. One of the things that could be so tempting to do is to, as we want to make a point, just exaggerate the particular elements of a story or numbers or fruitfulness. Let's guard against that, and let's be just rock solid, reliable in the things we say. Now, when it comes to basic communication skills, I do add this element here called personal hygiene. And the reason I've included this is because it's not unusual that maybe after we've given a message that there may be a time of praying for people. And praying for one another in the mission we're involved with is, of course, a very common thing. And we need to be just aware that our personal hygiene really matters. If you have had a meal of something that lingers on the breath, a nice onion-based meal, for example, then we want to make sure that we're not breathing a smelly breath over people when we're praying for them. And body odour, it can be something very distasteful and unfortunate if we're laying hands on people to pray for them. And let's just be aware of the use of deodorant or mints or something that we can actually love and serve people in this way. Let's give attention to personal hygiene in these kind of situations. Okay, just to talk a little bit more about maintaining attention, I want to talk about distractions. And these distractions are really in two areas. One is what I've called personal distractions, because they have to do with things about us that might distract people. And then the second is more the physical distractions around us. So the first I want to talk about are filler words. This is when people intersperse their speaking with words that are not necessary. Now, there's an extent that we all do this, to some extent, but really what we want to do is make sure we don't do it so that it distracts from people, it distracts people's attention away from hearing what we're saying. There are religious filler words, and maybe you've heard the preachers who keep filling their lines with praise the Lord, or let me hear a hallelujah, or amen. Now some of this is not bad, because what they're wanting to do is to get a response from the audience, but it can be so much that it actually becomes meaningless and distracting. But other popular filler words are, depending on your culture, the word yes or yeah. Sometimes I've heard people use the word yeah 20, 30 times in just a small piece of public speaking. Yeah. And maybe there's the or the a. Canadians love the a word. Young people love using the word like, repeated over and over again. I met my friend like down the road, and she said to me like, "What are you doing like tonight like?" And I said like, and so it goes on. And different cultures have their own different kind of filler words. Now, the thing about filler words is that we don't actually know we do it. And this is where feedback can be really helpful. That you can draw people's, or someone will draw your attention to the fact that you're using filler words. And then when you know it, you can work at removing them. So the use of filler words can be really quite distracting. Another thing is we can have distracting mannerisms. I remember on our first biblical teaching and preaching school, we had a wonderful brother from Africa, and on his first preaching to the class, he marched up and down the front of the room, the whole length of the room, walking backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And it was a bit like watching a tennis match as you were listening to him. And I don't know why he did that, but it was something that was distracting and was very easily rectified. We need to be careful about our use of hands, especially if we're having a handheld mic. The mic, of course, needs to be held up towards our mouths, but it can be easy if it has a cable to play with the cable. I think there's been many sound people that have got upset when a speaker will play with the wire, even on a microphone that either has a cable or maybe it's a wireless mic, but nonetheless there's a wire to the battery case, and to be playing with that breaks it. But that can be one of these personal distractions. And so whether we clear out our ears or whether we keep wiping our nose, all sorts of things, and again we often don't know we're doing it because it's a kind of a nervous thing. People telling us can really help us. And so we want to just be aware of these and try to remove them as much as possible, because we don't want anything to distract from the message we're giving. And so the second is what I've called environmental distractions. These are distractions that we don't necessarily have so much control over, although sometimes we do. It can be sunlight coming in and bothering someone. We've talked about that. The temperature of the room is too hot. One of the things can be competing activity. Now, maybe you've been in that situation where you're sitting in church, maybe towards the back, and just before the service starts, in come the new mum and dad with their little baby in the basket. They sit a row or two in front of you, and the baby is sleeping, and that everything's great. But then just before the sermon, or at some point in the sermon, the baby wakes up and begins to fuss, and what the parents would do is pick the baby up and put it on their shoulder. That's a favourite position. And of course, when that happens, the people in the rows behind, all of a sudden, their attention is not so much on the speaker, but it's on that little baby. And those sort of things can be distracting and of course hard to deal with. Another example is when you're in a class and someone quietly opens the door and tries to creep into the room and give a note to someone on the front row and then walk out. And you know that when that happens, people are not listening to the speaker anymore. What they're doing is they're wondering who that person is and what that note says and what's going on. I remember being at a camp years ago, a YWAM camp one summer, and it was on the flight path of London Gatwick Airport, and the aeroplanes taking off and landing would come right over the tent, and there would be this big roar that would drown out the speaker. And it was really interesting just noting the way different speakers dealt with that. You know, the best way often is to acknowledge this competition, and to maybe even pause your speaking. If someone comes in, you can just pause while they come and do what they need to do, or just pause if there's a noise. Maybe close windows to cut the noise out if necessary. Another area that can be competing, and this is something that the speaker can do but should never really do, and that is when they stand up to speak, they might give a photograph or something to people and say, look at this and pass it around. I remember one time doing this when I was speaking on, years ago, I was speaking on the book of Ephesians, and I had a postcard with the amphitheatre, the ruin of the amphitheatre there in ancient Ephesus, and I gave it to the class, and I thought this is a great visual aid, and I said, look at this and pass it around. Well, of course, that was a bit of a disaster because people were not listening to the teaching, they were looking at the postcard. And so what we want to do is be aware of those kind of things. A competing noise, this can be from outside the meeting room, it can be from the surrounding situation, and to do your best to minimize any distraction. To pull curtains or to close windows or to do whatever's necessary. The whole area of non-verbal communication is really a big one. It's been noted that most of our communication is actually not the words we say, but all the other elements involved. Not just the words, but it's to do with the facial expressions that we have, our eyes, it has to do with the tone of the voice, it has to do with the conduct as we're speaking. And there's these areas that you can reflect on and give attention to. The first actually that I've got there, has to do with the way we dress. As soon as we stand up, we're actually communicating even before we've opened our mouths. The way we dress makes a statement. And so when you are invited to preach or teach, do give attention to the clothes that you wear. One of the most useless pieces of clothing, in one sense, but the piece that can give off a major message is the tie. For a man, should you wear a tie? And the best way to handle this is to find out, if you're not familiar yourself with the setting and expectation, to talk to your person who's invited you and say, what is the expectation for the dress code? Because there is always a dress code, even if people say there isn't, there is. And the way I would suggest is that when you understand what the dress code is, you then dress just a little bit above what is expected. If it's casual, you will dress smart casual. If it's smart casual, then you would go above and be maybe formal. But whatever way it is, you are dressing just above. Especially, this is important in cross-cultural situations. In some situations, dressing wrongly can be a real barrier to people listening to you, because they've already passed judgment on you simply by the way you've dressed. Now, of course, we know that God looks on the heart, not on the outward appearance. But the truth is, of course, we can't see the heart. What we see is the outward appearance. And even though we shouldn't judge, often people do. And we want to give people every reason to listen to us and remove any possible barriers. Eyes, when we are speaking, we should be looking at people. If it's a smaller group, we look people in the eye as we speak, but we don't look at any one person too long. We keep moving as we are addressing the congregation. If it's a large group and eye contact is not possible, you still keep moving and looking around the audience. What you never do is look above people and look at the back of the room and just gaze at the back of the room. You keep your eyes looking at people all the time. Legs and bodies, the best way is as you stand to have your legs slightly apart so that you are standing on both legs, not hopping from one to the other. And if you're not holding a microphone, you bend your hands at the elbows and then let them do the speaking. Because, of course, as we speak, our hands often are involved in communication. And we're going to see in a few minutes that, if possible, people should see as much of us as they can. This really has to do with what is known as proxemics. Proxemics is really the science of the use of space. How do we use space? How close do we stand to the audience? And this will depend on culture, but the rule of thumb is stand as close as possible to your audience. I remember speaking in a large church in the country of Wales, in the United Kingdom, and it had once been full, a Methodist church, but now the congregation was very tiny, just a handful of people, and most of them sat at the very back, way in the distance, and there was one person who sat at the front. And so it was really awkward. It had a highly ornate wooden pulpit that was raised up, and then a platform that was below but was also raised. And the question is, where would I stand to preach? The pulpit would have closed me in and taken me further away from the people. If there had been no one sitting at the front, I think I would have walked down the aisle and stood close to the people. But I don't know whether that would have been appreciated, but because of the situation, I stood on the platform. You have to make these kind of decisions, but the rule of thumb is stand as close as you can to the audience and have as few barriers as possible between you and them. Now, it may be that you need a lectern or a stand for your Bible and notes. And if that is the case, then of course use one. But if you're able to put it to the side so there's nothing in front of you, all the better. But of course, the situation may be made for us, and it may not be possible. Of the use of a microphone, sometimes microphones are fixed on a pulpit, and you have no choice other than to stand in one place as you speak, so that the microphone can be of use. Another thing to consider is how the chairs are arranged. Are the chairs arranged in rows so people see the back of the head of the person in front, or is it in a semicircle, or in circles, or in small groups? How is it that the chairs are arranged? This, of course, may mean, it may be that you have no choice in that, but it is always something to give some thought to. Can people see one another? Again, that really has to do with the arrangement of chairs. And does that matter? What kind of message are you giving? Is it going to involve discussion, feedback, questions, or not? As mentioned, using the podium, it is best to have a kind of podium that either doesn't hide you, or one that you can push to the side if possible, because remember, the rule of thumb is as few obstacles between you and the audience as possible. This enables you to have a closer connection with them. I guess the rule is, as much as possible, take charge. Try to arrange things the best as you can, and to sort things so that there's the best use of space that you have. When it comes to the use of the voice, we've mentioned volume already, how important that is. It is really important that people can hear us. We need to speak loudly enough. But also the rate. How fast do you speak? People can process words quicker than certainly they can listen to them. People can read twice as fast as people can speak and still comprehend. But it does depend on the culture you're in, and of course the audience. Are your audience, do they have English or whatever language you're speaking as a second language? If so, it may be important for you to speak a little slower, and that has to do with enunciation as well, that we are actually speaking clearly. We're saying our words fully and properly, and rather than localized slang. I remember when I was first speaking in the School of Biblical Studies, teaching on staff. It was in Kona, Hawaii. Most of my audience were American, and I had a very British accent from the south of England. And I remember puzzled expressions on people's faces sometimes, as they weren't able to understand the words I was using, even though it was English. And I had to adjust and to speak really clearly. And so give some thought to these areas for excellence in communication. The use of pauses. Pauses can be used very powerfully, especially if you've made a really strong point. You may pause to have a drink of water. And that pause can be dynamic as people reflect on what you've said. Be careful in do give thought to vocabulary. Again, this has to do if your audience is people who have English as a second language, or whatever language you're speaking in, then you may need to use simple words. If you're addressing a group of college professors, it may be a different kind of vocabulary than if it is a group of young people. Be thoughtful about words. Now, of course, in your speaking and your teaching, you may need to use technical words, and there's nothing wrong with that. The important thing is that you explain them if necessary. And also pitch. This has to do with the intonation. Don't be monotone, but raise and lower your voice. So that has the effect of pulling people out who may have wandered in their thinking, as well as making it more interesting. Just a little bit about message notes. It's important that you have notes on what you're saying. I would urge you that your message is written out with a full written manuscript. The benefit of this is that it actually gives you the opportunity to think through not just the whole flow of the message, but the words that you're going to use, and you can reflect on those words. Now, one thing you would never do is take the manuscript into the pulpit with you and read it. That should never happen, because of course you will lose the life. But nonetheless, having written out the full manuscript, you're able to think it through and think through the words and the flow and everything. So it's very helpful. And then from the manuscript, you then have an outline, and you can take that with you, and that outline will remind you of the main points of what you want to say and how you want to say them, and to jog your memory. Now, some people try to learn their message by heart, and that gives a great impression of the message just flowing. But of course, the problem with this is if you have a mental block, you're kind of lost, and that can happen. And having notes is often expected and the best. Some use note cards. Note cards for public speaking are very acceptable, and as you have a bunch of note cards in your hand, they even, as you hold them, become an extension of your hand. As far as note cards or an outline, the rule of thumb is always only use one side of the page or the card and number them very, very clearly. And space it out and use colour and underline and different areas to make it really easy for you to read, because what you don't want to do is get lost in your own notes. It's happened where people have had notes blown off the podium and falling on the floor, and because they've not been numbered, because they have used both sides, it can be very difficult to get things back in order, especially with the pressure of the time. And so have a good outline of your teaching that you can take with you to the pulpit or to the podium. When it comes to reading scripture, what we want to do is to read it well. It is so easy to read scripture badly. And so do take time to read through the passage that you're going to read. Understand it, of course, you would have done that in your preparation. Speak out those hard words so you don't stumble over them. But above all, read with feeling and passion. Try to read it dramatically as you can. So the Bible reading isn't just that bit you add, but it's done with good strength, and it's interesting as you read it. And remember our own Source View Bible. This is where the different characters are outlined in the reading, and it's just excellent to get different people to be involved in that kind of reading. But read well. When it comes to illustrations and storytelling, I've mentioned how these are really important in your message. These are like windows that bring light and illustrate what you're saying. It is best never to read a story. Get to know it well and get to understand it. The story, it should be interesting, and beware of it being too long. It needs to be short enough so that it doesn't end up, people don't end up getting lost as you're telling it, but of course it needs to be long enough to do the job. So that is something you just need to be aware of, not to have a great big long story that's complicated and people can get lost with it, but simple and short and of course interesting. Practice being a storyteller to be able to draw people in. It has to, of course, to be relevant. You don't tell a story just because it's a great story with some vague connection to what you're saying. And let me say that can be a temptation if you have a good story. I know, I've been there. But it needs to be clear, it needs to be self-explanatory. In other words, it is clear why you're telling that story and why it matters in what you're saying. And just to repeat myself, it needs to be shared vividly. Visual aids can be really helpful. Visual aids can be helpful because they bring variety. And when you're speaking about something, everybody sees the same image. You could be talking about a house, and every person in that room would have a different idea of what you mean by a house. If it matters what they think, then it's important that you let them know what it is you're thinking. Visual aids, often the most common, is a PowerPoint or Keynote, and this can be helpful for an outline and can be interesting with pictures. So think about visual aids. I remember in one of our teachings there was a young woman. She stood up with one of these Pringle crisp chip tubes that she had covered with paper, and she had a metal plate, and she pulled the end off and she tipped out of this tube dirt into this plate. And what she said as she held this tube is, she said, "This tube represents my life." And as she tipped out the dirt there, she had cut up paper hearts, papers in the shape of hearts. And she said, even though there's been a lot of bad things, God has done some good things for me. She began to give her testimony about how God had met her. And this was a very powerful image. And so much so that even many years later, I've remembered it because visual aids can really help with attention. Visual aids can really save time. They can save time because they help people see the same thing, as I've said. But for some information, it really is difficult to present it any other way than visually. Maps, I think, are a really good example of this. Seeing a map is really important. And of course, visual aids do help the memory. Points to watch in using visual aids. Don't talk to them. It's possible, if you're using a whiteboard, for you to turn right on the whiteboard and actually talk to the whiteboard. Well, of course, that is difficult because people can't hear you so well. You don't have eye contact. That's a really unhelpful thing to do. Don't talk to the visual aids. Make sure that you are speaking to your audience. You may need to stand in a place where you can glance at the visual aids, if it's like PowerPoint, for example, but don't talk to them. I've already mentioned the danger of handing out a visual aid at random, because if you do that, people will stop listening to you. If you have a handout as a visual aid, don't give it out during the class. Or if you do, then stop so that people can look at it and read it and find out what's there. If you give a handout during a lecture, it takes people's attention away from you. You only do that if you're actually going to use it there and then and show people and have people read it. Then it becomes part of the teaching. Also, if you do have a visual aid, you have to stand in a place that doesn't block it. Otherwise people are trying to look around you and it can be annoying. And make sure you leave it long enough for people to actually see. When you have finished with a visual aid, it's good to cover them so that it's not distracting. If the PowerPoint or Keynote slide is no longer needed, then I know on PowerPoint, I'm not sure about Keynote, but on PowerPoint you can press the B key or the W key and that will blank the screen out, either make it black or white, and so the slide is no longer visible. That can be really helpful. If it's an object, then you put it away or you cover it so that it's no longer there distracting. And I've already mentioned it's important that people are able to see it, and so do leave it long enough for people to see.